Tales of Estolia by Sashina Kerfman. Read by Ken Moss. The Promise of Zaccarias, Part 1. Chapter 1. The Ankhamun. 721 years before the current era. Though my bones crumble, and the dust be scattered to the four winds, still I achieve immortality in the living world, if that which I inscribe in stone persists. Key. Inscription on the mossy rock. Zaccarias and Cayman, the first mate on the Ankhamun, both watched as Tabor, the newly hired seaman, helped the invaders tie their small vessel to the Ankhamun and climb aboard. Their words, softly spoken, were in a Moorish dialect. For Zaccarias, it was hard to wait and watch as they moved away from the rail towards the small pile of crates heaped haphazardly on the deck, where Tabor stealthily carried them the previous half hour. One crate was partially opened, and as the full moon slid out from behind the scattered clouds in the night sky, they could see the glint of gold within. When the marauders were all grouped around Tabor's plunder, Zaccarias looked at Cayman. He nodded. It was time. They carefully climbed down from the rigging, beckoning to the rest of the guards who had remained strategically hidden on the deck, signaling them to be prepared. While they were docked at Pequeno a day and a half ago, Zaccarias was enjoying a drink when Tabor entered the quiet establishment followed by 3 other men. He greeted Zaccarias cordially in heavily accented Anoxian and then sat at a nearby table. The 4 men spoke in the Moorish tongue, a variant on the language of Chela. Tabor arranged with the others when and where they should board the Ankhamun and remove much of the pharaoh's treasure. Zaccarias maintained a stoic, uninterested countenance during their entire discussion. Tabor must have thought that Zaccarias was deaf, simple, or a fool. No fool, Zaccarias sought to acquaint the first mate with the information about the upcoming raid. Captain Cafares was with Cayman, and Zaccarias was invited to share what he knew, and afterwards to be an active participant in their discussion on the best response to the information that they now possessed. The fight, when it came, was short. The pirates had no chance against their organized repulsion. Zaccarias focused his attention on Tabor, while the others took on the pirates. They caught them by surprise, and Tabor was no match for Zaccarias' skill with the blade. He felt his sword sinking into Tabor's gut and hid a shudder of distaste. Their eyes met, and he knew the moment Tabor's soul fled. He lifted one foot and pushed against his chest, disengaging him from the sword and throwing him overboard to feed the leviathans already awaiting their meal. He did not wait to see how the voracious creatures of the deep received their tribute. He swiveled and crouched, ready to deal with any of the other marauders. His caution was unnecessary. The first mate was already trussing up the last of the 7 pirates on the deck. Zaccarias carefully wiped the blade of his sword before putting it back in its scabbard. He joined the first mate and Captain Cafares, who were discussing their captive's fate. 2 of the pirates looked like they had not yet reached puberty and were identical in appearance. One pirate cursed long and fluently until a guard gave him a none-too-gentle prod in the back. In the ensuing silence, the captain said,
"Pirates are a scourge here in the seas of Centrarth, taking that which they have not earned, including the lives of those who make an honest living. I see no reason for leniency. We will therefore tie each of you to the deck of your ship and then sink it, so that neither you nor your vessel will ever again trouble the righteous plying these waters."
The pirates were all dragged to their feet. The oldest man, clearly the leader of the pirates, begged the captain of the Ankhamun.
"Spare my sons, I beg of you. They are twins, not even men, and they can serve you on your ship. Please have mercy, one captain to another."
Captain Cafares looked from the pirate to the 2 young boys. Zaccarias thought they must be only 10 or 12 years old. Unlike the teak-colored complexion of their father, their skin had a golden hue and their eyes were dark, shining with intelligence. They were watching the exchange, but did not beg or plead for their lives as some might.
"I go to the court of the 7 gods of Centrarth," the pirate captain said, speaking more to his sons than the captain of the Ankhamun, "to pay for my crimes and beg lenience for my kin who come after me."
He switched his attention from his sons to the captain and said,
"They are hard workers, and they will serve you and your vessel with loyalty."
You swear this?
Captain Kefares demanded of the 2 young men. They nodded in unison, and one of the 2 boys stated, his young voice solemn and serious,
"We swear upon our honor, under penalty of eternal death, with the 7 deities of Centrarth as our witness, that we will serve this vessel with utmost loyalty."
Zaccarias felt the flush of destiny, as he liked to call it, that prickling of the skin that told him he was witnessing something extraordinary. When the captain agreed, he felt proud to serve aboard the Ankhamun. Integrity was not enough. Mercy was another quality of character he valued. The 2 youngsters stood with the rest of the crew, watching as the pirates were secured to the rails and mast of the smaller vessel. The hull showed signs of a recent repair, and the first mate pried loose the boards. Those aboard the Ankhamun could see water rushing through the aperture, flooding the ship. Once the first mate was back on board, Captain Kefares had his crew maneuver the ship away from the doomed vessel, and they waited and watched as the bow sank lower and lower until the entire vessel slid seamlessly to the depths.
"May the 7 deities accept our tribute this day,"
Zaccarias said softly. He took a deep breath and then said to the first mate,
"The weather looks to be turning. I'll go aloft. Keep an eye out for those who would target us in foul weather."
He had liked Tabor for the short time he knew the man. He felt soiled that he was made not only to explain what he had overheard, but be the man to pass judgment on Tabor. Once he was at his post, Zaccarias scanned the horizon, looking for additional pirate vessels. All he saw was the dim iron-grey background of the sea and sky merging with one another, brooded over by the lowering clouds. It was a fast-approaching, unpredictable storm, typical for this region. The rising sun was hidden behind the sodden clouds. He heard the uncomfortable whinnies of the horses and the cries of his shipmates to one another. These sounds were muted when jagged lightning was punctuated by a clap of thunder. The storm raged around him. He was preparing to secure himself to the mast when a massive jolt almost threw him from his perch. The sharp crack of wood splintering and sudden dramatic listing to the side had him hanging on the rigging, scrambling for a more secure hold on the broken mast. He saw the horses were loose on the deck, whinnying in fear and anxiety as the surface under their hooves lurched and heaved in the tempestuous sea. Another deafening roar of thunder punctuated the lightning, and he saw the horses plunging through a break in the rail into the sea. The high-pitched scream of a woman drew his attention. He saw her attempting to swim beneath him, where the broken mast overhung the seething sea. She was struggling to stay above the waves, and he feared she would drown swiftly without help. Another lurch of the ship, and the mast splintered further. He dove into the water, hoping to rescue the maiden, but realized his mistake instantly. His sword was dragging him into the depths. He could not surface with it strapped to his side. He would have to offer it as tribute to the 7 deities, and hope they accepted the offering and allowed him to live. All these thoughts rushed through his mind in the moments before he unfastened his scabbard and released it. He shot to the surface and gulped in a deep breath before beginning his search for the woman. The horses were no longer visible. A desperate, spluttering cry oriented him. He saw the flash of her face before the water dragged her down once more, threatening to consume her just as it had consumed his sword. He dove after her, reaching her swiftly. He wrapped his arm around her ribcage and pulled her with him back to the stormy surface of the water. He could no longer see the Ankhamun, but what he did see was welcome. The bulk of land. Chapter 2. Conference. Very few of my protégés ever realized the critical purpose built into the different iterations of the grand design. Those who do, like Krynos and I, come to cherish that moment when it is time to start afresh, wherein 10 of the most refined and advanced beings convene and embark on the journey together. The participants come from each of the 5 dimensions of reality, matched and paired, refined and readied for that one pulse beat of existence in the great cycle when it is time to begin again. What better way is there to travel through infinity towards that elusive goal of eternity? Who, having been a part of the grand design, would turn down the chance to be both guide and guardian when the cycle starts again? Caleria, Musings on Eternity. Elora watched the gathered major deities selecting vast swathes of the planet. Their constraints and mission would be slightly different from the minor deities. She frowned when she saw Herschel selecting a vast tract of land in a southern continent. A shiver of unease ran through her system. She was distracted when she heard the chimes and she felt the thrill of accomplishment. It was time for the inception of the grand design. She swept her hand downward and then stepped through the black portal that appeared before her. She was transported instantly to a forest meadow, and sweet birdsong punctuated the crisp air. She only saw one other individual. "This is very pleasant, Alanis." Much better than the white marble amphitheater where the major deities did their selection and instruction. She tried to shrug off thoughts of the other participants and focus on the here and now. "Did you create it yourself?" "Yes." Alanis preened at the praise. She had worked on the forest glade for some time to make it perfect for this meeting of deities. She walked over to the circle of boulders and sat on one of them. Elora sat on another, and as the others arrived, they each chose a boulder, until 10 deities were sitting in one large circle. They leaned forward, heads bowed, when Krynos and Caleria stepped out of nothing and into the center of the circle. "Today we begin the grand design," Caleria said. "Each of you will impact the lives of the people within a specific region. Give edicts to your charges and guide them. Follow up on the promises you make. You may have as large or as small a link with your people as you wish. The only thing you cannot do is eliminate their free will." Krynos cautioned them.
"While each of you will work to impact your chosen realm of influence, other deities from alternate cycles will be working on their own designs. Take care that you do not interfere with their subjects."
Krynos and Caleria taught them all they would need to know to participate in the grand design. Time itself ceased for this critical instruction, as those who were gathered for the inception of the project absorbed the information necessary for success. When they finished, each of the 10 deities was fully prepared, ready to take the first irrevocable step. The 2 instructors stepped to the side, and in the center of the glade a small, nearly colorless globe now floated, representing the planet upon which the grand design would play out in all its intricacies. Pastel shades colored some of the land masses and seas, indicative of the areas claimed by other deities who had already been through instruction. When she first saw the globe, Elora felt a surge of pride. This was her contribution to the grand design, her belief in what would make the true difference to success or failure. This time there would not be 1, but 2 layers of deities responsible for interacting with the citizens of this world. The interactions between the major deities, who had already chosen their regions, and the minor deities, seated in this circle and awaiting the chance to make their selections, was, she hypothesized, the missing ingredient from all previous iterations. Each deity took turns choosing a small region of the planet within which they would have the ultimate authority. They could extend their influence beyond the boundaries of their region, but only to those who were tied by blood or faith to their chosen domain. When it was her turn, Elora hurried to the small globe and settled her hand over a small island in a vast inland sea. Her theory was that it would be easier to control the interactions of her people and those of the greater world if they were on an island, easier than their landlocked counterparts at least. Her grand design required her subjects to remain somewhat isolated in the infancy of civilization, much easier to achieve with an island than it would be with a region on one of the larger continents. She returned to her seat and relaxed as she switched her attention to those still awaiting their turn. Faloran ran his fingertips over a mountainous region in the largest landmass, and Paldea picked a coastal region quite close to Elora's island. Krynos looked around the circle of deities, settling on Zenta.
What region do you select?
He asked her. Like the others, Zenta did not hesitate. She approached where Krynos stood next to the globe. The 9 regions each pulsed with the colors of their respective deities.
I choose to forego the role of deity and instead take on an advisory role.
With a flick of one wrist, she caused the globe to rotate around its invisible axis. She settled her hand over a small region on the west coast of a large northern continent.
Here, I will help shape events to promote my goals and those of the grand design by interacting with those who venture into my region. I know my direct influence will be held in abeyance for thousands of years, but this part of the globe will, in time, bring together a concentration of people from other parts of the grand design. I feel constrained to impact events rather than individuals.
Elora felt a surge of excitement. She glanced over at Alanis, and they both got to their feet so they could approach where Zenta stood. Elora extended one hand to Zenta and one to Alanis, and waited while they completed the circle.
I knew,
Alanis said,
the instant you touched the globe, that my citizens and those of Elora would both come to this region, and that together our threefold influence will be an integral part of the grand design.
Elora felt the solemn weight of responsibility as she looked from Alanis to Zenta, then towards Krynos and Caleria.
There will be a nexus in this region, tying together our diverse religions and bringing the purpose of the grand design to fruition.
Once the 3 returned to their respective boulders, Krynos touched the globe. The different regions stopped pulsing and began to glow fiercely with the colors of the respective deities, as the planet itself imprinted their ownership on those regions. Caleria intoned,
"Let it be so recorded. The selection of regions for the grand design have been made. We shall reconvene at the appropriate time."
The colors on the globe began to fade, along with the glade, the deities, and the circle of boulders. Each participant began the critical preliminary work for their grand design. Chapter 3. The Grand Design.
The children of Zaccarias will never be asked to do more than they are capable of doing.
Hieronymus Jeremiah, Capitulo 2. The island Elora constructed from an idea was beautiful. Nothing in her existence prior to the grand design prepared her for this moment. This was the substance of her dreams, flavored by her imagination, augmented by her individuality. She compared it with the other lands in the grand design. None came close to her creation in style, beauty, or grandeur. Among the fine details put together for the island destined to hold her people, she was proudest of the 2 mountains at the center. Both were riddled with caves, caverns, and corridors. The first was much taller, with 2 crests. The second mountain, on the other side of the narrow valley, was shorter, but with a much larger footprint and a fanciful summit that was flat like the palm of a hand, decorated by pillars of rock in the semblance of skeletal fingers reaching skyward. Halfway between this peak and the base was a grand plateau, and where it met the sides of the mountain, her people would discover the entrance to one of the networks of caves. The southwestern quadrant of the island was a massive tableland, higher than the rest of the island, with an impressive waterfall leading into a central lake. The largest network of caves was within the tableland, but not nearly as easy to gain access. Two large bays dominated the east. 3 separate ocean channels led to the bays, but only the middle channel held a safe approach through the many submerged rocks surrounding the island. The main island was ringed by hazardous waters, making it unappealing for those who might consider invading. The flowering fruit trees peppering the island were one of her gifts for the faithful, with unique species of butterflies and bees to pollinate the plentiful blossoms. Her most critical achievement was the way inhabitants of the neighboring island saw it as unimportant, small, and therefore not worth the effort to explore, particularly when they considered the potential risks to their ships. Once it was fully prepared, she needed to find the right sort of people to accept her as deity, who would live the edict she would give them. Without that, it was all for nothing, and it had to begin with a single man, a man willing to agree to the requirements placed before him. Finding a man to bestow her blessings upon was harder than she expected. So many of the men she happened upon were coarse, intemperate, motivated by sexual allure, and untrue to their word. She walked unseen through the markets in many of the bustling population centers ringing the inland sea. The dark souls of the seething throngs of people buffeted her from all sides. This interaction with humanity was a hazard she had not considered when she fought so hard to be part of the grand design. It was, however, a critical step. Her design could not move forward without the perfect man for her purposes. The man she was following impressed her with his intellect. Just as she considered selecting him for her grand design, she was halted by what she saw within him. His thoughts shifted towards sex. She could work with that. But as they grew specific, she was repulsed. No, this man would not work as the one to begin her experiment. She had time before she had to settle on one man for her grand design, but it was discouraging when finding the right man seemed impossible.
Perhaps you want more than any man can give.
Elora turned and saw it was Zenta walking next to her. Zenta, who had no people, no part of the grand design for many more human generations. They walked next to one another through the shopping district.
Maybe you're looking in the wrong place, or for the wrong type of man.
Elora stopped and gestured to another man she had considered much earlier and discarded.
See this man? He is strong of body, intelligent, but he will not work in my grand design. He lacks the qualities of character necessary for success. What is it you want or need then? Intelligence, strength, bravery, loyalty, and above all other things, integrity. He must be capable of the necessary belief to follow my commandments. Perhaps your search is too far from where you wish your progenitor to flourish. It may be the compatibility you seek requires proximity in addition to those other qualities.
Zenta's voice was earnest. Elora looked from the bright colors of the fabric vendors to the vendors of metals. Perhaps she should look closer to her land.
You are wise.
Elora thanked Zenta before moving her awareness from the eastern city to the region which held her island in the western half of the sea. She would choose one of the cities near her land, Anoxes or Chella or Palmara. She was immediately aware of a ship passing close to her island. The ship was a merchant vessel, heavily laden with cargo and livestock, the Ankhamun. She explored the hearts and minds of each man toiling on the ship. Most were unsuitable to her design. In addition to the men, a stowaway was hidden among the livestock, a woman. She was ready to move on when she realized there was another man on the ship. He was high up in the rigging, on the lookout for pirates, and was a large, imposing, physical man. He was illiterate, like most of the people of this era, but quite intelligent. Elora took the time to read from his mind his story. The important elements began exactly 5 years ago. He called himself Zaccarias. Chapter 4. Zaccarias. In the ancient world, the life expectancy was quite short. When you eliminate infant mortality rates, however, The average lifespan of individuals was very near and in some cases surpassed that of those living in our modern era. Samuel Zaccarian, Master's Thesis. Zaccarias came into the living area of the house and saw that only his mother was there. "Where are Father and Phineas?" he asked. He had hoped to catch the two of them before they left the house. "Those two mares that Hiram sold your father decided to both go into labor at the same time," his mother said. "They're down at the stables overseeing the miracle." Her voice was sharp and exasperated, but overlaid with the fondness of more than 30 years of marriage. "I shall tell them that they are to return to break their fast before they are to go on to the normal work of the day," he promised his mother, before giving her a hug and striding towards the entrance. It was only a short walk to the stable yard, and he could hear his mother chuckling as he left the house. His father and his brother both stood outside the two large box stalls for the mares they had acquired earlier in the year. In the first stall, there was a sturdy foal standing next to the mare, already nuzzling for sustenance. It was a colt, the gender obvious as he swished his tail vigorously while enjoying his first meal. Zaccarias then turned his attention to the mare in the stall his father and brother were watching. She was delivering a foal with barely a grunt at the effort involved. He watched, fascinated, as the foal immediately struggled to get to its feet. "Bit small, isn't it?" Zaccarias said. His father's response held an edge of amusement. "Wait, watch, learn." Zaccarias stepped closer, alarmed that the mare was still on her side. She should have been on her feet to encourage the foal's efforts to stand, helping the umbilicus to break as well. In this case, the mare was only neighing in encouragement and reassurance from where she lay prone on the stall floor. When her whinny changed tenor, the three men watched another foal swiftly join the first. So this was what his father meant. He had no experience with any horse giving birth to twins, but twin lambs were generally smaller than their single-birth counterparts. It made sense that this would be true of foals as well. "Fillies," his father said triumphantly. He had expressed the wish frequently that the two pregnant mares would provide him with a colt and a filly. 2 fillies and a colt made the event all the sweeter. They waited until all 3 foals had their first meal before Zaccarias urged his father and brother to return to the house. They were seated at the table, enjoying his mother's incomparable cooking, when he broached the subject he had planned for this morning's meal. "I have been asked to join the crew of the Ankhamun as one of their armed guards. She will be in port in a 7-day. His mother looked up and caught his eyes, holding back incipient tears. He looked at his father and saw that he understood. "I did not think you would remain." "You are sure?" Phineas asked him. Zaccarias clapped his brother on the back and said regretfully, "I believe that my fortune and future are on some distant shore. This farm is in your blood. You and your Anuri should formalize your relationship, bring many sons and daughters into the world for mother to dote upon them. He had to swallow on the catch in his throat before he could continue. "I must find my own place in this world, and it is not here in Anoxes." "It is dangerous work," his mother said, her voice trembling. "I am strong, mother. Can you imagine anyone risking my wrath?" She shook her head and looked away, tears rolling down her cheeks. She swallowed and said, her eyes on the plate in front of her, "I always knew that I would one day have to say goodbye. May the 7 gods of Centrarth see you happy and healthy." "We shall have a celebration before you leave, and if you are ever in port again, you must visit." His father's words were gruff, as if he felt the same emotion as his wife, but could not demonstrate it as freely. The words felt like a blessing, and Zaccarias was warm to his core at his parents' sentiment. But he was almost 25, and it was time for him to move on. Chapter 5. Permission. I am often credited with amazing feats during the time I was keeper of the soul of Estolia. I did create a wooden model of Mount Zaccarias and Mount Estoliana, trying to envision what both would be like when they were built up to match the image within my mind. I also instituted the acolyte and elder years of study. However, despite the multitude of creative acts laid at my feet, the one thing I know above all others is that I have been the voice of deity here upon our world. The whispers of truth that have echoed through my heart and mind over the years, all that I have said and done, can be attributed to deity. Amador, Capitulo 1. The final image that Elora gained from Zaccarias' mind was the fight with the pirates, and his gratitude when the captain of the Ankhamun spared the young twin sons of the pirate captain. Zaccarias had an unswerving devotion to what he perceived as right. He was exactly what she was looking for, a man of great physical and moral strength, ruled by loyalty and guided by intelligence. He would serve her grand design, if he was willing. He had the qualities she wanted and needed, but he had to agree. Her design required compliance, or it would never work. She needed more than one man willing to promise allegiance to her. The female stowaway was from south of Anoxes, fleeing a destiny she was smart enough to realize would not suit her, as third wife of an abusive older man. She wanted something more from her life than to merely be the object in a barter. She could serve Elora's needs. She felt the tingle of excitement and anticipation. This was it then. The two people who would be perfect for the inception of her grand design, if she could obtain the rights from the deity or deities responsible for them. Once she decided these two could beget the dynasty necessary for her grand design, her attention then turned to the other souls on board the ship. She could not meddle with the followers of any of the other deities, not without a polite request at the very least. She composed the request to lock this couple in as her chosen progenitors, if it was permissible. One last peek into their minds confirmed her choices, and she sent a request for all deities who held sway over this ship, her crew, and this region to come to a conference. A rumble of thunder in the wake of a lightning strike just off the bow heralded her request, and then the scene froze amid the sound and fury of the sudden storm. On the storm-racked deck of the Ankhamun, 3 deities stepped through portals into the conference she had convened. She waited a moment longer to see if any other deity would manifest, but none did. I am Elora. This island is my domain. She pointed to the shadowy outline of the island off the bow. She brought forth an image of the 2 individuals from the Ankhamun. I wish to begin my grand design with these 2 individuals. If there are no objections, I would have this ship wrecked upon the rocky shores of my land, with only the cargo and my chosen subjects able to make it to shore. The male deity stepped forward. He took in Elora's petite frame, short stature, golden hair and small breasts before looking at the other 2 deities. They were both more beautiful than Elora.
Territory,
he introduced himself. He was as impressive a physical entity as Zaccarias.
I control this sea. All upon it are within my authority. I enjoy the occasional shipwreck in the pursuit of a good cause. I'm sure I can find an incentive to cooperate.
The way his eyes roved over the breasts and bodies of the female deities made it clear he was looking for sexual favors to provide the incentive. Elora recognized the 2 female deities as participants in the grand design. The first to speak said, I am Paldea. The 2 you wish to adopt are from Anoxes, the region over which I hold complete authority. She moved closer to the image Elora called up, studying the 2. Both left Anoxes with no intention of returning. Neither are critical to my design. You may have them. She then turned to Terratray, looking him up and down. She curled her lip in disdain. With a swirl of her skirt, she stepped through the portal, quitting the conference. The 3rd deity was looking at Terratray with speculative interest. A slow smile grew on her face when their eyes met. I am Kunara. This ship and her fate is immaterial in my part of the grand design. She glanced towards Elora briefly before returning her attention to Territre. With a wave of her hand, an image of two golden-skinned, nearly identical boys from the Ankhamun coalesced in front of her. These brothers are indispensable to my grand design. I have read the future, and they cannot perish in this shipwreck.
Perhaps a compromise.
Territre's eyes travelled over Kanara yet again, his sexual attraction obvious.
I can wreck the ship, with the loss of all hands to the sea. Your subjects,
he said with a gesture towards Elora,
will be swept to your island.
He stepped closer to Konara.
While your two will be swept away from this island on the wild and wicked currents which abound here. We can guide them to Polmara, and from thence influence events to produce the outcome you desire.
Your offer intrigues me. She moved towards him, one hand reaching up to caress his chest. Shall we make it happen? Territre covered her hand with his own, and the two of them faded out. Time resumed flowing, and the ship started to fight the strength of the wind in the sails, heading towards the edge of the land Elora had so carefully prepared. Chapter 6. Estoliana. Obedience is our first lesson as acolytes. We learn the virtue in following directions that seem unimportant, so we will give greater attention when we discover what will be required of us as the sons of Zaccarias. Timoteo Salazar, Capitulo 48. Zaccarias dragged the unconscious woman onto the stone-riddled beach. Water poured down his face as he looked back the way they came. There was no sign of the ship. It either sank or was pulled away by the fierce currents. The heat of the winter sun beating down on his neck pulled his attention away from the mystery woman. Streamers of once ominous clouds were rushing away, leaving the sky a bright, unblemished blue. He looked around, but couldn't see any place more comfortable than the rocks he was already standing on. His medical knowledge was limited to the ways to tend a wound in battle, and how to breathe life into someone who drowned and was no longer breathing. But she was breathing already. He could not revive her, but he could move her away from the swirling waves above the high tide mark. She would have to wake on her own. Stooping, he picked her up, groaning at the effort it took. Normally, he would have no issue in lifting a woman of her height and weight. He ignored his physical discomfort and focused on a tree with pleasant-smelling, unseasonable lavender-colored blossoms. He laid her gently in the shadow of the tree and then leaned against it, breathing heavily, trying to catch his breath. Where did she come from? There weren't any women on the Ankhamun. She was young and beautiful. He would have heard if any of the men had a woman on board. He looked up and down the shore, but could not see any of his companions from the Ankhamun. All he could see were dozens of crates, large and small, washing up onto the rocky shore. The ship must be a victim of the sea. At the thought of Cayman, Captain Kefares, and the other men on the ship, he had to bow his head in prayer to the seven deities. Guide my companions, all who lived and worked upon the Ankhamun, that they might discover paradise in the life after this life. After a moment of thought, he added, The two boys, Isol and Lundar, please guide them as well. He felt better when he opened his eyes. When he got his strength back, he decided to secure the crates. As salvage of a ship that sank, the erstwhile cargo was the property of those who recovered it. The inhabitants of the island might be hostile. He could bribe them with the items originally destined for the Pharaoh. If the island was uninhabited, then he might need to use them to obtain a berth on a passing ship. Aside from those considerations, Zaccarias was not an idle man. He could not relax while some of the cargo was about to be swept back out to sea. During a pause in his work, he looked over to where he left the woman and saw she was sitting up and looking around. He waved in her direction before returning to his work. He was trying to move a huge crate, but it kept stubbornly hanging up on the rocks. On his next effort, it finally began to move. It was only as he succeeded in pushing it above the high tide mark and towards the tree line that he saw a pair of shapely hands had joined his, providing the extra power necessary to complete the job. He wiped the sweat and salt off his brow and turned to look at her. "What language do you speak?" He used the dialect from a coastal region of Anoxes, hoping she would understand him. "I speak several languages," she responded with clear, unaccented Anoxian. "I am called Zaccarias." "Estoliana." She looked up and down the rocky coast. "This is Pequeno. It is tiny to those passing it in ships, and large to those walking her shores." He tried to judge the size of the island from what he could see. "It doesn't appear very small to me." "Of course it doesn't. That's part of the legend." "How do you know so much about it?" he asked. "I heard this ship would be passing near Pequeno. I hoped I would be close enough so I could swim ashore." Not sure how to respond to that assertion, he straightened up and looked away from her. He saw several other crates the tide would likely reclaim if they were not moved out of reach of the waves. He returned to his job. When she joined him and continued to help him with his self-imposed task, he asked, "Why would you want to come here?" "My father wished to wed me to the captain of the guard at Anoxes, the cruel man known to beat his wives. I left. I am not a dutiful daughter." "Yes, but why come here?" She looked around. Who would not wish to live their life in paradise? For a while they worked together in silence, moving the smaller items well beyond high tide, pushing the larger, heavier ones as far up the shore as they could. "What sort of people live here?" Zaccarias asked. She cocked her head to the side, looking at him as if he was peculiar. With a small smile tilting the corners of her mouth, she said, "The legend of Pequeno says it will not be inhabited until—" Her voice suddenly changed. Chapter 7. The First Vision. The 7 deities of Centrarth referenced in our earliest records were, for a time, the dominant faith of the Mediterranean. The history of its evolution cannot be traced. Those who followed the faith, like Zaccarias' family, believed that there was a god, and that one of the 7 dominant religions in Centrarth must be the correct faith. Rather than try to divine which one was the one true faith, they chose to address all of their celestial communications to all of the gods of the region, so that no one god would feel slighted or ignored. The closest equivalent in the modern world is omnism, the belief that some aspects of all faiths are correct, while not needing to ascribe to and follow the more onerous rules of obeisance for those selfsame faiths. Though it was not obvious to Zaccarias and his followers who came to live on the island, through the lens of time and history, it is easy to see how this omnist faith in the 7 deities promoted the eventual belief in the deity of Estolia. Gideon Zaccarian, designates journal.
Until those who are worthy walk upon her shores.
The voice superimposed over Estoliana's voice echoed like the sound one heard when listening to a seashell. Zaccarias could feel the voice to the very depths of his marrow. He turned and saw a woman in a robe standing just above the high tide mark. Her hands were clasped, and she had flaxen hair and large, unfathomable grey eyes. She had the same petite build as Estoliana. "This is your island?"
"No, Zaccarias, son of Ezekias and Amadora, this is your island. If you are willing to accept the charge, I shall lay at your feet."
"Who are you?" He felt a thrill of excitement at the thought of this land being his.
I am deity. Those who live in this region believe the island is small and unimportant. This is my influence.
She moved closer. Her eyes locked with his and continued,
Battles, wars, struggle and strife will periodically come to the islands in this region. A land must be blessed to avoid being torn asunder by those conflicts. This land, Zaccarias, will be blessed, both for you and your children, and their children, until time itself ceases to be.
Zaccarias was well-traveled and fascinated by stories of celestial favors granted to regular mortals. He did not recall ever seeing any proof of divine intervention in his travels.
Blessings are easy to give. Many of the people I've encountered in my travels faithfully follow the dictates of their deity, giving great devotion, but in the end, their god or gods do not provide the substance of the promised blessings.
I am very simple. I shall give very few commandments, with tangible, specific blessings and promises. Behold the woman Estoliana.
She pointed to the woman he rescued. Zaccarias looked at her. She was not taking an active part in the conversation. In fact, she had been speaking when her voice changed and became the deeply resonant voice of this woman who claimed to be deity. She stood silently, as if unaware of the conversation taking place. She wasn't quite immobile, but he sensed she was disconnected from time, or perhaps he was the one no longer connected to the regular passing of time. He noticed how beautiful she was. Her hair was almost dry, a rich honey gold, similar in color to her eyes. She was much shorter than he was, with broad hips and beautiful breasts that were the perfect size to balance out her looks. Her features were pleasant. She was a desirable woman.
If this island was to become yours, what blessings would you wish?
Are you certain you wish to know? I have an active imagination and could easily wish for more than any deity might want to grant me.
She laughed. Her laughter was, he thought, like the music of angels singing, or the sound of bells ringing.
Zaccarias, your imagination, your intellect, your personality and character, all these I knew before I chose you to be the founder of a nation, a dynasty, and a religion. Speak aloud your dreams. What do you want for your land, your kingdom? I promise to listen to your dreams, to grant everything you request that is within my power, if you are willing to do what I ask in return.
Her expression and body language communicated sincerity and a deep and abiding belief in what she was offering him. He would lose nothing by voicing his deepest desires and his fondest wishes. If she was insincere, he wasted only his breath in sharing his dreams. If she was sincere and capable of granting him his wishes, he would gain by sharing. There seemed no reason to remain silent.
To always be prosperous,
he began, thinking of some of the people he saw in his travels.
And for my children and their children to have the same prosperity.
He did not wish for any of his sons or daughters to be forced to seek their fortune far from family. When she urged him to continue, he did.
I would want my people to be protected from famine, disease, and disasters. I would need to know we were safe from the lawless and merciless pirates who roam these waters, and from those who might become envious of our prosperity. It matters to me that my children, and their children, and so on, would all know they have the same assurances. I would wish for a deity who can give simple, easily kept guidelines, and not require an obscene level of worship.
He looked again at Estoliana and added,
My descendants will need to be able to find worthy mates, willing to perpetuate the faith I will establish.
I like you, Zaccarias.
She smiled, and he felt a rush of warmth and approval, which did more to convince him of her sincerity and power than anything else she did or said.
I influenced you both to come here to this island. Name it Estolia, after her.
She moved closer to him, her grey eyes meeting his, her expression inscrutable.
I shall give you promises the likes of which no other man has ever received from deity. Only you can decide if you are willing to believe in the promises I will give you. Only you know if you will be willing to do what I command to secure those blessings.
Deity moved even closer to where he stood. She lifted one hand and placed it over the abdomen of Estoliana, the other hand taking his.
You turn 30 tomorrow, Zaccarias. Tonight, after the sun fully sets, on the eve of the anniversary of your birth, you will exchange with Estoliana her most valuable possession for yours. What I command of you, I command of your descendants. Inasmuch as your posterity keeps your promise to me, I will keep mine, until time ceases to be.
What could I give Estoliana? I have nothing but the contents of these crates from the Ankhamun. He didn't even have his sword. Deity responded to his question, her voice settling into his marrow as before, chilling him with the impact of her words, the meaning behind them.
You will give your soul into Estoliana's keeping, Zaccarias. The substance of your soul will be the exchange you will make. That is what she will take from you when you take her purity on your 30th birthday. When she does, you will be pledged to her forever. If she were to reject and leave you, you would die.
Chapter 8. The Promise. Eastern philosophers believe that the basic elements of nature are earth, air, water, and fire. In Estolia, Amador, Key, and Sebastian believed that the more important question was what they were made of. They postulated that every person was comprised of three elements: body, self, and soul. Zaccarian, Capitulo 1. Zaccarias felt his skin prickle as her words hit him.
No man can live without his soul. The promise I give you today, Zaccarias, is that you and your nation will know great prosperity. None of those who will fight and battle on these turbulent seas will see in your land anything of value. It will be unremarkable to all who see it, and left to grow in prosperity into eternity, so long as you and your male descendants keep to the constraints I will set you.
If no man can live without his soul, how can I enjoy prosperity?
She continued as if he did not speak. Estoliana will conceive a son as a result of the extraordinary exchange you will make with her. This is my gift to both of you, for taking part in the exchange.
But to exist without my soul?
You cannot exist without your soul. Once you give it into Estoliana's keeping, you must not try to exist without her. Too much time apart will grow acutely painful. You will measure your lifespan by the lifespan of your wife. Part of the prosperity you and your people will know will be a longevity and a health unheard of in this world.
He wanted to believe. If she spoke the truth, he needed her to specify what he had to do to obtain the blessing she was promising.
To get all you promise, what must I do?
What I promise to you, I promise also to your male descendants from now until time ceases to matter. They are to do the same as you. Find a woman pure of heart and body in their 30th year. Wed her within 7 days, and remain faithful to her for the entirety of their lives. Like you, they will give their soul into the keeping of their wife, and I will give them a son in return. As long as you, Zaccarias, and your male descendants fulfill their part of the bargain, your nation will enjoy never-ending prosperity. If you or your descendants fail to wed the woman within 7 days, your nation will also fail before one full cycle of the seasons can pass. This requirement I give unto all your male descendants. The heir to your title must take it seriously.
Every son I have, and their sons also, for all time must live this promise, or the nation fails. It sounds like there is at most only a few generations where this will happen. If we have longevity, prosperity, many children, then the number of descendants constrained to follow your dictates becomes vast.
Not that he wouldn't grasp hold of the promised blessings for himself. He felt a surge of disappointment in the future. It would not be sensible to expect every descendant to keep the promise he was willing to make.
Have I said yet how much I like you, Zaccarias? You will be sovereign, king of Estolia. Your firstborn will be your heir. He is constrained to adhere to my commandment, in his 30th year to find a woman pure in body and mind, and then wed her within 7 days of intimacy. If he cannot fulfill this promise, then your second son, or the second son of the monarch at the time, will, as a last resort, take on the burden of compliance. I shall gift your male descendants, especially those required to keep your promise to me, with the ability to see the soul of the woman who is their perfect mate. They will see it as an aura of great brilliance confirming her purity and suitability as their partner in this life, and as the one woman on the planet who can keep their soul.
She stepped towards him, her eyes boring into his.
You and Estoliana will be blessed with long lives, freedom from regional disputes, and granted guidance as a nation. So long as you and your heirs keep your promise to me, your nation will never fail.
He didn't respond right away. He looked away from those fathomless grey eyes and down at the beautiful woman standing mute and unaware of the conversation. What of Estoliana? Does she get no choice? Is this what I am to teach my sons? To find and take the women of their choice regardless of their wishes? As much as he desired the woman he rescued, he didn't wish to be like the men he met in his travels, taking without asking. He wanted for himself what his parents enjoyed, a partnership. This deity could strike him dead, but he would not agree to an arrangement favoring only him. When she didn't respond to him, he finally looked at her, expecting to see anger. Instead, he saw approval.
When I first noticed you, Zaccarias, I could tell you are a man of great character. Ask Estoliana to be yours. You will discover that she is as attracted to you and to the concept of permanence as you are to her. Be certain the wishes of the daughters of your land are honored by the men who will call themselves Estolian.
You have my promise that I will do as you have asked, and I will teach my children, so they will know what they are constrained to do from now until time ceases to be time. If Estoliana will have me, he added under his breath. He felt the weight of the promise he was making, as if it was molded out of the stuff of his soul.
Do not forget what you have promised me this day, Zaccarias, son of Ezekias and Amadora.
Chapter 9. Pharaoh's Crates. To follow the urging of deity and subsequently feel the promised rewards is itself one of the greatest blessings in this life. Amador, Capitulo 1. In a flash of light, deity was gone. Estoliana continued speaking as if the entire conversation had never taken place. Until those who are worthy walk upon her shores. Zaccarias looked at the beautiful woman whom deity proclaimed would be his mate, who would keep his soul safe and protected. He could think of no woman more beautiful than she was, especially with the golden shimmering glow of the aura he could now see. You are correct. Deity looks out for this land and brings us here together. He looked at the crates strewn up and down the rocky beach. We should focus on the smaller crates. The larger ones are less likely to be swept back out to sea. While they worked, it occurred to him that the cargo bound for the Pharaoh was evidence of how deity was already providing for them. The sun was dropping toward the west when Zaccarias said, "We must find a good location to spend the night." Estoliana pointed towards a mountain peak in the distance. "Let's go in the direction of those mountains. First, we should see what things the crates hold that might improve our comfort." One of the crates had several large bags used as padding for the sculpture within. Estoliana joined him and looked in at the golden cat statue partially visible. She lifted her skirt, which was encrusted with salt and stained by seawater. "I never thought I could wish for something other than a gold statue. I would prefer some clean clothing." Zaccarias pulled several bags out of the broken container and handed them to her before picking up a couple of his own. Earlier, he had noted that the last few crates near a rocky outcropping had been partially smashed, and the contents within were visible. One appeared to contain garments of some sort.
The Pharaoh has a taste for fine apparel, insists upon it. We should investigate those crates, he pointed.
She started to move in the direction he indicated, but then paused, looking at him with a slight frown. "What about you, Zaccarias?" She reached out and touched the shredded shirt hanging off him, brushing the caked sand off the skin over his ribs. He had to contain the shiver of reaction to her touch. He cleared his throat before saying,
"We will look together."
She laid several of the cloth bags on the rocks and started pulling garments out of the crate. The first item she pulled out was an elaborate dress. Her lips parted and she exhaled sharply. One delicate hand brushed over the intricate beadwork. "This is a work of art," she whispered. She carefully set the dress down on the cloth bag, smoothing it with one hand. A soft sigh punctuated the moment when she turned her attention back to the broken crate. The next item was a simple creamy-colored sheath. She held it up in front of her body and then beamed a happy smile in his direction. "This will work." She pushed several additional items into one of the cloth bags until she came to some that were undeniably masculine. As with the dresses, the first was elaborate. The tunic did not boast the same type of beadwork, but the embroidery was intricate, in bright primary colors. Without asking his opinion, she pushed it into a second cloth bag. The next item she pulled out was as simple as her own outfit, an off-white tunic or overshirt and a sturdy set of workmanlike breeches. She held them against him, tilting her head to the side before her lips curved upward in a smile of pleasure. "These look like they were made for you, Zaccarias." He took the proffered items and then glanced down at his attire, seeing the skin showing through the rips. His clothing was ruined, and he was filthy. "I saw a small stream near those two trees. We could rinse off and then change into clean clothing," she observed. A rose-colored flush on her cheeks emphasized the beauty of her bone structure. He followed her to a warm hollow filled with sluggish water. "I will bring you some more of those bags. You can dry yourself with them and then dress," she told him. He pulled the ruined clothing off, piling it on the bank nearby. When Estoliana returned, her eyes were fixed on the clothing and cloth sacks in her hands rather than looking at him. "Here," she said softly. She set the items down within his reach and then turned hurriedly. Speaking over her shoulder, she said, "Let me know when I may return and do the same thing." A short while later, Zaccarias left Estoliana bathing in the stream. He moved towards the broken crates he thought held some food and other delicacies. He packed a few things in the sacks methodically, but his thoughts weren't on what he was doing. He stopped to feel the new breeches. They were a higher quality weave than he had ever worn before. He raised his right hand to the lapel of the shirt and rubbed it between thumb and forefinger, feeling the richness of the fabric. He felt as if he'd suddenly risen in rank from mere hired muscle to the nobility. That was when it struck him, like the coldest mountain stream water rushing down his spine. Deity proclaimed him a king over this land. Did he really have a conversation with a goddess? He could feel an echo of confirmation, as if she listened in on his thoughts and answered his question. He tied the last sack closed and then knelt on a broad rock. He closed his eyes and focused his attention inwardly towards Deity. He promised to keep his word every day of his life, and to teach his descendants to do the same. Chapter 10. Purple River. In the ancient world, romantic tales were usually the stuff of legends only.
and family units were nearly always fashioned out of expediency and familial loyalty. But in Estolia, the concept of love took on a much deeper meaning. The rich soul-to-soul connection between the two halves in a marital relationship in Estolia simply defied description. The keeping of the soul was, in truth, the greatest of the gifts from deity to the sons of Zaccarias. Even in our modern world, the most extravagant tales of romantic love come nowhere near to what Estolians not only expect, but also experience. Fernando Gilmar Zaccarian, Capítulo 75. When Zaccarias got to his feet, he felt renewed and invigorated. At a sound behind him, he swiveled and saw Estoliana coming towards him. She was now a stunning vision of loveliness. She wore jeweled sandals and the creamy-colored sheath dress. Her hair was pulled back and fastened away from her face. She held a couple of the large bags stuffed full of items. A wide plank stuck out of one of them. "Are you ready?" he asked her. She nodded, and then followed him as he struck out towards the distant mountain peak. They were still within sight and sound of the inrushing tide when he noticed a thick line of trees and foliage off to their left. He gestured towards the greenery. The water in the stream was not very fresh. He wrinkled his nose in a grimace. "I am hoping we can find some fresh water. That looks a promising direction." It didn't take long to reach the thick line of trees. They could hear the purling sound of water over stones as he led the way through the foliage. They both came to a sudden halt at the vision presented to them. There was a river paralleling the trees. It was purple. "I've never heard of a purple river," she said. He set his bundles down and moved to the edge of the water. Up close, the purple color was not as brilliant as from a distance. He pulled off his sandals and waded in. The water was soothing against his skin. He looked back to the bank of the river where Estoliana was watching him. "Is it okay to drink?" she asked. He bent over and scooped up some water in his hands. It looked clear, without color, like water should look. The first handful leaked out while he studied the color. He scooped up a second handful and brought it to his nose to smell it. It seemed to smell exactly as water should smell. With one more glance at Estoliana, he scooped up a third handful and took a sip. It tasted like water should. He grinned at her and scooped up another handful. "It's delicious," he told her. He felt something break under his foot and glanced down curiously. A dark burst of color in the water near his foot alarmed him. When he moved his foot, he saw there was still a rapidly spreading plume of purple rising from where he crushed something. It wasn't blood, as he thought to begin with. When the water cleared, he saw a half-crushed snail. "I think the purple comes from the snails that appear to be quite common here." There were dozens, perhaps hundreds in the water. Estoliana sat on a large rock and began unlacing her sandals. He moved closer to the edge of the river, ready to assist her if she needed it. He crushed several other snails underfoot and left behind a trail of thick purple color. He was almost to the shore when he heard a deep voice proclaim behind him,
Willow wall.
He pivoted rapidly, his hand slapping his hip, regretting the loss of his sword now more than ever. He crouched slightly, ready to defend Estoliana with his bare hands if needed, and scanned the vicinity looking for the new threat. Nothing. Large, clumsy birds were standing on the far side of the river, and a few were floating on the surface of the water, looking at him curiously. He shifted his stance, preparing to look around more carefully for whoever called out to him.
Willow wall. Willow wall.
He swiveled back around, knowing the sound was extremely close. It was only then that he realized what was happening. He looked at Estoliana. She was holding her sides and laughing. "It is the birds themselves who speak." He was embarrassed. When her laughter spent itself, he said to her, "The water is most refreshing." She stepped carefully into the stream and drank for some time. When she finished, she picked up a snail, looking at it curiously. She crushed it in her hand and they both stared at the purple pigment. When she dipped her hands in the water, she had to rub them together vigorously to get the purple color to wash off. On the far side of the river were scores of birds. They were ugly things, he thought. Big, bulky bodies, clumsy when taking off or landing. Brown, grey and white feathers. The only redeeming feature was their brightly coloured beaks, some yellow, some purple. Despite the ugliness of most of their plumage, they had tufts of green, purple and yellow accent feathers on their faces that were as bright as the rest of their plumage was dull. The accent feathers gave them a comical appearance, especially when they made their peculiar sound in a deep, masculine, human-like voice. The beach on the far side of the river was the first sand beach he had seen on the island, and it was teeming with the willow walls. There were a few large caves in the side of a massive butte which bordered the purple river as far as he could see. He considered trying to cross the water to make use of the caves, but the buzzard-sized birds seemed to be quite numerous, living in the caves, and there was no clear vegetation on that side of the river. Just sand, caves, and birds. Once they were both fully refreshed, they continued their walk upstream. For a while, the plateau on the other side paralleled the course of the river. Then it started to angle towards the water. Ahead of them, it looked like the land jutted out at a right angle to the water, cutting it off. It was only as they neared the impressive plateau with, at the end, the stump of an old mountain, that it became apparent the river flowed through a tunnel. They could see the glint of sunlight off the water in the depths of the tunnel. The spit of land in front of them must not be very wide. A second stream of water trickled down along the edge of the plateau, and they turned to the right to follow it towards the crumbling remnants of the old mountain. The distance was not great, and they discovered the stream they were following bubbled up from the ground. Estoliana went up to the edge of the pool of water and knelt on the moss ringing it. She dipped her hands in the water and raised it to her mouth, sipping at first and then drinking deeply. When she was done, she brushed the excess water from her mouth and said,
"I've heard of springs like this, where the water itself is a gift from deity."
"It is clear, Estoliana. Deity is with us, guiding us."
He didn't know how to share with her what he learned earlier. He knew what he wanted to do, but she needed to choose to be part of the future deity promised him. He could not expect to receive the blessings he was promised if he did anything against the will of this woman. His eyes met hers, and for several heartbeats they were looking at one another. Finally, he broke the connection and looked around. The features of the location seemed to be ideal for a settlement. He set his burdens on the ground and walked up to the pond at the base of the rocky outcrop. The water, when he tasted it, was even more pleasant than the purple river water. Estoliana set her bags at her feet and also looked around. She was looking to the south, back the way they came. Scattered around them was a field of rough stones. Zaccarias imagined a once grand mountain, shaking off the rocky facade of its youth before relaxing to enjoy the weathering of old age as nothing more than a pillar of rock. Beyond the tumbled stones was a grassy plain, the sort which might take to the production of crops of grains and other foods. The trees he recognized along the watercourse were olive and almond trees. He remembered the last place that the Ankhamun took on cargo, the island of Pequeno. He helped bring the cargo on board, lashing it to the top of other crates, bundles of sticks that the first mate said could be planted and would produce a wide variety of fruit trees. He would have to see if he could locate the bundles and plant them properly.
"This looks safe and well placed for us," he told Estoliana. "I believe we should stop here."
Chapter 11. Legend of Pequeno. In the ancient world, the most famous source of the color purple was attributed to the town of Tyre, hence the name Tyrolean purple. The color was a reddish purple. One of the earliest immigrants to Estolia was a man from Tyre, with his wife, brother, and brother's wife. They recognized the potential when they spied the tarsus snail. They compared it to the snails used in Tyre and found that there were similarities and differences. The tarsus was edible and delicious, but the purple was obvious the instant the snail was crushed. In addition, the tarsus was a much smaller snail with a very fragile shell. From research done on the Tyrolean snails, there are other quite significant differences. The biggest difference was in the color produced. Estolian purple was closer to blue than red. Later, once the dye was perfected, it was traded to those in Tyre so that they might make a richer, more royal dye. In this way, Estolia grew wealthy while escaping notoriety. Meredith Zaccarian, History of Estolia. For Estoliana, the man who pulled her from the sea, Zaccarias, reminded her of the statues created by Antarin, the palace sculptor in Anoxes. He was almost too perfect. Tall, well-defined muscles, broad shoulders, and slender hips. During the battle against the pirates, she watched from her hidden position among the bales of hay. He moved with grace despite his large size, and was the type of man a maiden would wish to have as a protector, as more than a protector. If her father had decreed that she was to be his mate, she would not have rebelled. His instinctive reaction to a perceived threat, when the willow-wall bird startled him, revealed his character, willing to protect the woman who was with him, even though she was a stranger. She felt safe knowing he was with her on the island. Thinking about safety reminded her of her reasons for fleeing Anoxes. She was gathering eggs in the fowl yard and checking on their broody hen to see if her eggs were close to hatching. From her position kneeling next to the nest, she was not visible when her father and the captain of the guard, Standish, entered the barn. She idly stroked the hen, one of her favorite birds, while watching and listening to the two men. Standish was leading Galadin, a magnificent bull her father coveted ever since their own bull sickened and died. With the breeding season upon them, he had been desperately searching for a bull to set to his cows. He could not allow his entire flock to remain fallow for the season. The two men were discussing Galadin's superior size and conformation. Estoliana was pleased that her father had not only replaced his former bull, but managed to secure the one animal he wanted above all others. "I promised Petros," Standish said, "that you would allow him to select two of Galadin's issue prior to the spring market season." Her father's next words had her listening in horror and disbelief. "Estoliana will provide you many fine sons. The nuptials will be an auspicious opening for the winter festival." The rest of their conversation was lost to her as her mind raced over the implications. Bitterly, she realized she was worth nothing more to her father than a bull. She would be turned over to Standish, regardless of her feelings, regardless of his record with women. She couldn't do it. That night she made plans. She would use the artifice her mother taught her, hide her beauty, and run away. One of her friends, Davina, had moved to the seaport, whereupon a sea captain took her as a mate. She travelled to her friend's new home, but Davina pointed out that the captain would, if he discovered her, return her to Standish, so she slept in the hayloft over the stable. During the days, she spent time in the markets disguised as an old woman, listening carefully to passing conversations and trying to find a place to go where she would be safe. This was the first time she heard the legend of Pequeno. A few days after she hid in the loft, Davina visited to tell her, "Berto will be returning in 2 or 3 days." She did not meet Estoliana's eyes when she said, "I fear that he will see that I am deceiving him." "I do not wish to cause you problems, Davina." Estoliana glanced at the slight bulge of her friend's pregnancy. Her mate, Berto, did not know that she was bringing him the fruit of their marriage bed. She was looking forward to surprising him, but it would be marred if she was trying to keep a secret at the same time. She asked, "Have you heard of Pequeno?" "I've heard of it. It is between Izquierdo and Polmara. Isn't there some legend about it?" They spoke for some time, discussing the legend. When they were done, the two women had a plan. Estoliana would wait until dark, and then she would sneak aboard the Ankhamun, a merchant vessel bound for the mysterious southeast of Centrarth. It would stop at Izquierdo and then head to Polmara, passing close enough to Pequeno for her to swim there. There was a risk she would be discovered, but she would rather risk the unknown over submitting to Standish and his vile temper. Sneaking aboard the merchant vessel was easier than she expected, and she was able to hide among the horses. Her attention snapped back to the present. She was now alone on Pequeno with Zaccarias. He began to pull supplies out of the cloth bag he carried with him, spreading out the rich bedding he told her was once destined to grace the bed of a pharaoh. The location he selected was in a slight depression thick with grasses which would make soft bedding. He made only one bed. She turned away from him and started to rummage in one of the bags she brought from the damaged crates. She had fruit, bread, cheese, olive oil, and wine. She found a couple of boulders that were at the same height and perfectly placed so she could lay the plank on top of them. It was a serviceable table. She spread a couple of the cloth bags onto it as a tablecloth. Upon this makeshift table, she placed the container of wine and the 2 glasses. Setting the loaf of bread to one side, she poured some of the rich olive oil in a broad shell she'd collected from the rocky beach. With fruit and cheese, it was a feast fit for kings. They might not dine as well in the future, but they would dine well tonight. They ate the meal quietly while the sun dropped towards the horizon. When they were done, she asked him to share his story with her. He smiled in response to her request, and she noticed just how good-looking he was. He had grey eyes, dark hair, and a beautiful face. "My father is very healthy. Our family are long-lived, and he will be active farming the land for another 20 years. But when he is ready to pass the land on, it will go to my brother." He shrugged. His voice didn't seem to hold the edge of hurt. "My brother is the oldest. It is right that it will go to him. I had 2 choices. I could stay and work the soil by my brother's side, or I could seek my fortune and my future in foreign lands." "You are not bitter?" "No, Estoliana. My brother Phineas knew I would not return. My father said I would need to journey until I found myself, and when I did, I would know it and remain there. I have been traveling for 5 years, working as a hired sword. I feel as if I have found myself." His hand swept in a wide gesture, taking in the beautiful island surrounding them. His voice was rich with pleasure when he said, "This land has taken a hold of my soul." This was her destination. She wanted to make this place her home. She did not know how to respond to his assertion. He continued, "Deity sent us both here. Bless this land for our use." She wished she could see his face, see the underlying meaning behind his words. They did not have a fire, and the last vestige of the sunset was now fading away in the night sky, making it impossible to see his features. Chapter 12. Keeping the Promise. Heaven, paradise, nirvana, all these are words used to describe that place wherein an individual achieves eternal happiness. Images and descriptions of what it will be like range from the simplest of existences to the most extraordinary. Many of those afterlives, as described, sound unappealing, but then, to many, Torizon is likely an insipid reward for the faithful. How can any man who has never yielded up his soul know and understand what it is like to have it kept?
And to prolong that joy until time ceases to be, who would want anything less? I enjoy my life here upon this world, in my flawed mortal body, and I look forward to Torizon, where I will be with my Kaylee forevermore, living in a new body, together exploring all that I did not have time for during my life upon the planet. Our adventures in that new realm will last until time itself ceases to be, and our joy will be abundant.
Kedero, Preface to the 12 Postulates of Inner Peace. The yawn that punctuated the indigo darkness didn't require light to see. It was loud, and Estoliana immediately yawned in response. Come. He held out his hand to her. Let us rest, Estoliana. It has been a most adventurous day. First the wreck, then the gathering in of supplies, and then preparing this place to sleep. He sounded as deeply weary as she felt. He began the day by fighting off pirates. He must be exhausted to have done so much in so short a time. She placed her hand in his, and allowed him to lead her to the luxurious bed he spent so much time making. Once they were next to it, he stopped and turned her so she was facing him. He settled his hands gently on her shoulders. She could feel the heat emanating from his body. Was this the point where he would assert his right to her body in the night? I will be honest with you, Estoliana. I desire you. You may even feel the reaction of my body to yours. But I want you to know I will never do anything without your permission. You are safe with me. She believed him. She closed the gap between them and wrapped her arms around his waist, resting her head on his chest. Thank you, she told him. They stood together for several heartbeats before she pulled away from him. She bent down and slipped her sandals off. She didn't have anything to wear to sleep in, so she would remain in the soft dress. The bedding, once she settled down into it, was comfortable enough for a king or a pharaoh. She saw Zaccarias start to prepare for bed, but fell asleep almost instantly. Estoliana woke to the sound of an owl hooting. A bright full moon was shining down on the clearing where she and Zaccarias were lying next to one another. His arms were around her. When he moved, she realized he was awake, probably awakened by the same owl. He propped his head on one hand and looked at her, the moon glinting off his eyes slightly. You are an incredibly beautiful woman, Estoliana. You are quite attractive as well, Zaccarias. Estoliana. His voice was gruff, thick. Deity brought us here to be together, to establish a nation together. I wish to follow the dictates of deity and make you mine. She wanted him, wanted to believe what he was telling her. Zaccarias, I have heard men say many things to try to get me to couple with them. Why should I believe your words mean anything more than any other man? He was silent for some time, as if searching for the right words to say. When he sighed, he sounded defeated. I do not know how to convince you of my sincerity. He brushed her hair away from her eyes, smoothed it back, and gently caressed the skin of her face with his thumb. I have traveled for 5 years in search of my destiny. I did not know when I was hired to guard the Ankhamun that I would be presented with 2 of my dreams at the same time. I wish to make you mine, Estoliana, not for tonight or until we are rescued, but for all time. And if you are willing, when the first opportunity presents itself, I wish to wed you. From the moment I really saw you, I knew I had discovered my destiny. I wish to remain here, on this island, with you, until the day I die. Here? Yes, here. He was emphatic. Deity has given the 2 of us this land to rule over, to fill with our children and their children. It is our land. We have but to fulfill the dictates of deity, and we will be blessed all the days of our lives, together. He leaned towards her and kissed her, his lips alive on hers, the warmth of his breath feathering her face as he pulled back. His hand rested on her hip. Estoliana, deity has promised us prosperity,
Together, this land is ours to rule. I have never wanted anything as much as I want to claim you in my life, as my life. Say you will be mine, my lady, my queen, the keeper of my soul. Create with me here on this island our very own nation." "Here, on Pequeno?" she asked again. She reached up to caress his face. She was tempted to give in to this man, to believe his outrageous claims about the island, about deity, about her. "We will name our land Estolia," he said. Did he really mean to keep her, claim her, and name a nation after her? Forever? She could hear the wistful longing in her voice. She did not wish to be a transient part of his life, of the nation he claimed he would be creating on this island. "Forever, Estoliana," he whispered, "until time itself ceases to be." He kissed her again, moving his hand from her hip to the small of her back, pulling her body closer to his. She could feel the hot rigidity of his desire against her flesh.
"Zaccarias."
She accepted him, and she knew he could hear it in the way she said his name. He slid his hand to the hem of her dress and pulled it up, his rough calluses rasping over the skin of her thighs and hips. She sat up and pulled the dress over her head, pivoting to place it next to their bedding. He pulled his shirt off, and then lifted his hips to push his breeches off. When he pressed the hard length of his body against her, her heart began to race. She touched him freely, marveling at the masculine body that was, to the touch at least, far more impressive than the stone statue she admired as a young girl. His fingers fluttered over her ribcage, while his mouth explored hers. She caressed his face as his hips slid between her legs, and then she gasped when their bodies merged. They were perfectly matched, their movements in tune with one another, as if they shared the same mind and soul. Her body arched under his, and she felt his emotions flooding through her. His satisfaction to feel her body enveloping his, her soul consuming his. Their voices complemented one another as they both cried out at the culmination of their coupling. A flood of warmth rushed through her body. She pulled him close, wrapping her arms and legs around him, pulling him tight. Just as she needed to know that he would always be with her, from now until time was no longer time, she sensed his own desperate need for reassurance, that she would never leave him. Chapter 13. Establishing Estolia. The great bounty of deity in the earliest years has never been adequately recorded by the men who make the safety and future of Estolia their primary concern. We could never have survived without the small and seemingly insignificant blessings that spiced our lives and enhanced our comforts. As a mother cares for all aspects of her child's needs at a young age, and smiles upon the independence that comes with maturity, so too did deity see to our needs with abundance in the infancy of our nation. Ensayo of Estoliana. By the end of their 6th day on the island, Zaccarias felt as close to Estoliana as his parents always seemed to be. He was certain that he could read what was in her heart and mind when they were in contact with one another. They spent their time working together to make a more permanent shelter and increase their comfort. They also made multiple trips each day to bring back as much of the cargo from the Ankhamun as possible. In addition to those practical pursuits, they took frequent breaks to spend time getting to know one another intimately. On their 3rd morning, they woke to find half a dozen mares watering at the spring. Estoliana approached the mare nearest her, catching hold of her halter. Zaccarias did the same with another mare. These were the horses from the Ankhamun that he last saw in the water near Estoliana. The bulge of their midsections reminded him that they were all expected to foal in the spring, a clever method of shipping 6 animals, but expecting 12.
"I forgot about the horses on the Ankhamun," Zaccarias said. "I spent time caring for them."
He enjoyed working with them, as it reminded him of his final days in Anoxes and the horses his father delighted in breeding.
"I watched you," she admitted. "I was hidden among the livestock on the Ankhamun. They are beautiful. Do you think we could use one of the chariots we discovered to bring the largest crates here?"
The day before, they found several chariots, half assembled, laced together, and resting among the seagrasses. Zaccarias had pounced on the several packages of bound sticks they also found. He explained that the sticks were fruit tree starters, and if they could get them planted, they would improve the variety in their diet. He set aside the precious bundles, submerging their roots in a small stream making its way to the ocean, then helped Estoliana pull the chariots well above the high tide mark. They left them, since they were irrelevant without horses to put between the traces. He fondled the ears of the mare nearest him and answered, "Yes, I think we could bring the rest of Pharaoh's crates here to the clearing, if we used the power of these animals." Over several days they retrieved the remainder of the cargo from the Ankhamun. They opened each crate they brought to their settlement, investigating the contents, hoping to find items that would be useful to them. A few contained delicacies capable of withstanding a long journey. Their diet was a peculiar mixture of the humble foods gathered by the couple and the delicacies only the pharaoh could afford to eat. Most of the crates did not contain food, and Zaccarias carefully resealed the ones that held only jewels and precious metals unnecessary to their survival. On the 7th day they watched the sun rise from their comfortable bed. Once the last glimmers of dawn had faded into daylight, they dressed. "Tomorrow," Zaccarias began, but he was interrupted by a voice calling out to them. They both turned to see who was hailing them. Estoliana moved close to Zaccarias, whose hand was on the fine sword they had discovered among the crates. A mounted man was astride a magnificent pure black stallion. Noblemen and marauders alike preferred the medium-boned animals that were smaller than the large workhorses farmers use for plows and raw power. This animal had power and stamina, an ideal mount for many purposes. The 6 mares they had in their herd were a cross between this type of animal and the fine-boned, speed-focused breeds of Araby. Once the stranger dismounted, the robe he wore reached his ankles. It was a thick weave of dark brown, resembling the bark of the needle-leaf trees prevalent inland. It reminded him of the robe worn by deity. It was unpretentious with 2 exceptions. The first was the sleeves. Each had a teardrop-shaped opening that fell almost to the hem of the robe. When the man clasped his hands together, the sleeves created a chevron pattern that pointed to the ground. The only other extravagance was a braided rope around the man's waist, fastening the robe closed. Each end of the rope had an end cap of metal worked to a fine point. He looked like he was a man who communed with deity. The man walked towards them with a sure and confident step. He led the stallion casually, as if the 2 were close friends. When he reached them, he bowed low. "Greetings," he said. "I am Sebastian." He used a dialect they could both understand. "I am Zaccarias, and this is Estoliana. Welcome to Estolia." He hugged Estoliana to his side. "This is our land." "I'm blessed to have discovered your unique island. I am a humble man with a sensitivity to deity, and felt my skills were needed here." This was how deity was providing him the chance to marry the woman who had taken hold of his soul. "We do require the services of a servant of deity. Estoliana and I have been waiting for the opportunity to wed. Will you do that service for us?" "I would be honored to formalize your union," Sebastian said. Estoliana excused herself. When she returned, she was wearing the jeweled dress she discovered in the crates on that first day, and holding the fancy embroidered tunic out to Zaccarias. When he took it from her, he was reminded that they were only together 7 days. It seemed remarkable that he could be so close to a woman who was unknown to him 8 days ago. Now, he truly could not survive without her. Throughout the ceremony, Zaccarias felt as if deity herself was present, sealing their union with her holy approval. Once Sebastian was done with the service, Estoliana invited him to join them for some of the last of the delicacies from the Ankhamun. During their meal, Sebastian learned their story and briefly shared his own. Zaccarias felt compelled to share his vision and discussion with deity. Estoliana had heard the entire story on their second day on the island. This was a test for Sebastian. Would he accept what he was told? Sebastian's expression was not easy to interpret once Zaccarias finished speaking. Finally, when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper.
Few men are as blessed as I am, Zaccarias, to be directed by deity to find acceptance and purpose. I hope you will accept me as a citizen of your nation and allow me to serve you and call this nation my own.
Zaccarias felt peace sweep through him. He heard a whisper of a feminine voice telling him,
"This feeling, Zaccarias, is the way I will confirm your choices are right."
The whisper was still echoing round and round in his mind when he stepped towards Sebastian and embraced him.
I have need of permanent guidance. You are welcome to stay here, forever.
Chapter 14. Sebastian.
Many individuals came to Estolia's glorious shores during her infancy. They arrived singly and in groups and came with desperately needed talents and skills that enhanced the quality of life for all Estolians. In retrospect, it is easy to see the hand of deity guiding them to us. Among those who were inspired to make Estolia their home were experts in many fields. By the time Zaccarias was ready to turn over his reign to his son, the community he wrought through the power of his personality and convictions, and with the influence of deity, was like no other society in the wide world.
Sebastian, Inscrito. It was almost 2 months after the marriage ceremony when the first 2 settlers arrived, guided by deity. The man was large, dark-skinned and bald, and he had an ageless quality, as if he had lived several lifetimes. His near black eyes were eloquent, and his vivacious wife had a way of understanding what he wished to say and speaking for him. She was as talkative as her husband was silent. She introduced herself as Mari, and her husband as Ki. She used the language of the Moors, but vowed she would learn their language rapidly. Shortly after the introductions, with Zaccarias translating, she said, "I sense that you are with child, Estoliana. I wish you to know that I am a gifted midwife, skilled as a healer, and I will be here to help you with the birth." Their numbers steadily increased after Ki and Mari joined them. People brought to their land through chance, circumstance, and the urging of deity. They were very busy in those early years, building stone dwellings against the base of the mountain. Sebastian, Ki, and Zaccarias spent much of their time together discussing deity and their plans for the future of Estolia. They named both the crumbling mountain, no more than a pillar of rock, and their settlement Promisa, after the promise Zaccarias made to deity. Ki quickly found a role within the developing society as the royal scribe. He recorded Zaccarias' words on the side of the aged and crumbling Mount Promisa. As she predicted, Mari was able to help Estoliana give birth to her first child, a son she called Zaccarian. He was barely a month old when Estoliana and Sebastian helped Mari give birth to Chimerian. Zaccarias felt moved by the spirit to give both boys a blessing on their 7th day of life, a tradition they continued for each child born to the young nation. Ki made a record of each blessing on the parchment, giving it to the parents with a dramatic flair. The blessing of Zaccarian, as the heir apparent, was inscribed on the sides of Mount Promisa, along with everything that Zaccarias taught them. While Zaccarias held Zaccarian and blessed him, he looked into the infant's face with all the love of a father for his son. He spoke from the depths of his soul and could feel the power of deity in each word he spoke. Afterwards, he could not remember a single word of the blessing, but when Sebastian read the words that Ki had recorded, he recognized the influence of deity in every word and syllable. Deity would always speak through him when it was necessary. The blessing promised that Zaccarian's direct male descendants would be king of Estolia far into the future, even beyond 1,000 years. Chimerian's blessing predicted a different but no less fulfilling future. He would work with horses and find the love of his life on the island. His work would be very important to all Estolians. Sebastian prepared 2 special cleansers he said were inspired by deity. Key added a third, and Mari explained how all 3 cleansers were to be used. A specific order of use was critical, she said, so the spirit of Anubis couldn't contaminate and claim the life force of a woman and her newborn child. After the birth of Zaccarias' first daughter, he learned why Sebastian was content with his role as celibate spiritual advisor. "Your daughter is healthy and vigorous. Mari tells me your wife came through the birth safely, quickly, and without any damage. Deity smiles upon you and Estoliana," Sebastian told him. The 2 men were silent. The sounds of the women in the other room, the squalls of the infant, everything was a familiar augmentation for the young community. Sometimes, Zaccarias felt as if the only purpose behind their efforts was to be a nursery for the rapidly expanding population. When Zaccarias saw a wistful expression on Sebastian's face, he asked, "What is it, Sebastian?" When he spoke, his voice was thick and emotional. "I envy you, Key, and all the other men. The pride you must feel when your boys begin speaking our language, walking to you. Everything there is to enjoy in your progeny. It is the only emptiness in my own life." Zaccarias was quiet for a while before he finally said, "Why have you never asked deity for a woman to ease your loneliness, even if you cannot find the one to keep your soul?" Sebastian's eyes were mournful, damp when he admitted, "As a young man, I seduced the daughter of a powerful man. I was made to pay for my crime." He reached towards his groin and admitted, "I was unmanned and turned over as a slave when I survived the punishment. I was to serve the family most injured by my crimes." Zaccarias had known there was some deep secret his advisor kept from him. "How did you come to serve deity and make your way here to Estolia?" "I believe I was changed by the punishment that rendered me incapable of being a father. I sought to reach out and serve deity, to find my future in the spiritual realm." "And deity answered?" "Oh yes," Sebastian said, his voice full of the marvel of that experience. "For the years between my punishment and the time I fully embraced a role serving deity, I was growing closer and closer to the spiritual realm. When I fully accepted that my life belonged to deity, I felt a great release of tension. Not long afterwards, I was able to save the life of a child. As a reward, I was given my freedom and Migo, my stallion." "And how did you find Estolia?" "I became widely schooled in my travels, learning about the soaps of cleanliness and other medical techniques, and how to commune with deity. I took the position of horse handler on a ship traveling from Araby to the southwestern shores of the sea. I learned the shipmaster pocketed most of the money he was given to feed the horses. I tried to insist we dock in another port and take on sufficient feed to keep my charges alive. I was whipped for my temerity. By the time I recovered from my wounds, several of the horses were near death. I felt the whisper of deity telling me I must leave the ship and take my charges with me. In the night, I urged the half-starved horses to jump into the water. The captain saw what I was doing, but said nothing. It was only when my stallion and I were the only 2 left that he insisted I feed myself to the leviathans of the deep, as he put it. This was off the shores of Estolia. I thought we were near a different land. Once I realized we, the horses and I, were on an uninhabited island, I named it Corlia. There was much the horses could eat, and soon those who survived their travails grew fat. I was told I should travel across the nearly impossible rocky strait south of Corlia, and continue west along the southern shore of the larger island until I came to a purple river. I was told I would encounter those who had a need of a servant of deity. Who told you this? Deity. Sebastian's voice was matter-of-fact. I knew that I would be needed, that I would find my destiny. I heeded deity's urging, Zaccarias. Are you happy with us here, Sebastian? Yes, I am happy here. I have found my purpose in life, and I believe I will achieve a type of immortality in the impact I will have on your children,
and on the children of the other Estolians who have joined us, who bring life to our nation. Truly, I would not exchange the life I know now for that which I had in my youth. Chapter 15. Explorations. One of the great debates the elders indulge in while studying in the temple is the influence of deity in the formation of the land of Estolia. Some elders insist deity formed the caverns of the temple and the bones of the palace, so the sons of Zaccarias could easily create the marvels of architecture we now enjoy. Others argue that deity's influence was in the way the creativity of the early generations was enhanced, so they could see how to use the natural formations and create those fabulous structures. Regardless, it is certain we are all blessed by the beautiful constructs of our earliest generations here in Estolia. Thomas Ellison Zaccarian, Capitulo 71. 2 months after the birth of Zaccarias' daughter Miriam, he and Key were sitting on the stone bench near the small spring bubbling forth from the base of Mount Promisa. Sebastian joined them. Karna brings forth twin boys. Mari says they are sturdy, healthy, and will make fine men. You predicted you would be carrying twins, Zaccarias said. The next generation numbers 40 souls, Sebastian said. His voice was full of satisfaction. Zaccarias turned away from the large stone building and looked towards the north. In the 5 years they had lived in Estolia, they developed the settlement on the southern shore of the Willowall region. The only exploration they did was shortly after Sebastian and several others had joined them. They rode horses on the rocky beach towards the east. One of the defining characteristics of the region around Mount Promisa was spires of solid rock randomly thrusting up through the ground. Key, in his silent way, called them dragon spines. Originally, they thought they were only a feature of the southwestern region of the island, but once they started to explore, they discovered that they seemed to permeate the island. They slept under the stars on the 2 nights they had spent traveling away from Promisa, and on the 3rd day had discovered a marshy region at the mouth of another river. Beyond it, they came upon a massive ship keeled over on the sand just below the high tide mark. It was the Ankhamun. He could still see the Ankh symbol within the cartouche, even if the rest of the stylized name was obscured by wind, weather, and tide. It was responsible for bringing him the greatest happiness of his life. This region of Estolia will be named after the Ankhamun, he declared. The only cargo remaining were several ingots of gold. They returned to Promisa with what they could carry. Sebastian made a few more trips to first secure the rest of the gold, and later with some of the men to disassemble the ship and store the wood in one of the Willowall caves. A large pillar of rock stood sentinel in the surf, one of the dragon spines, and Key inscribed Zaccarias' declaration about the Ankhamun on its sides. Apart from that one trip of exploration, they were so busy creating the settlement that they had never yet ventured any further from Promisa. I believe, Sebastian said, looking with him towards the mountains, deity wished us to wait until the time was right to explore this land. When will be the correct time? Now, Zaccarias. I believe deity speaks to us and urges us to explore the heart of Estolia. Our crops are abundant, our livestock is plentiful, and we have loyal, strong men to watch over Promisa while Key, you, and I travel north. I feel the pull of deity to explore. You should travel north, my love, Estoliana said. Their daughter was suckling at her breast, and his 2 sons held onto her legs. You are sure? Time spent apart from her could become painful. If deity asks it of us, then deity will also comfort us. Her faith was an example to all Estolians. Simple, straightforward, matter of fact. One could not know Estoliana and remain unmoved by the purity of her faith.
Late the next day, Sebastian, Key, and Zaccarias reached a verdant valley that stretched to the northwest. The dragon spines were more abundant within the valley and on the mountains than in any other region they had so far explored. The three men focused their attention on the two impressive mountains which had guided them throughout their journey. They stood sentinels over opposite sides of the valley. The taller mountain was to the southwest. They could not make out the features as well as they would like. The sun was setting behind it and it was thrown into darkness. On the northeast side of the valley was the second mountain, equally as impressive as the first. For Zaccarias, it felt like he was home, truly home. He would live and die here. He gave silent thanks to Deity for her wondrous influence over his life and prayed his children and their children would always be true to the promises he made. The mountain to the northeast had a greater girth at its base, but it was shorter and looked like it was once the more impressive peak. The flat top of the mountain was 2/3 as tall as the other summit, but enormous dragon spines thrust up like the fingers on a man's hand, as if the mountain itself was reaching to grab a handful of sky. About halfway down was a broad plateau that stretched for some distance. He could imagine horses grazing on the nearby flat plain. He wondered if, like much of Estolia, there were caves leading into the mountain from the plateau. He could envisage a grand structure built using the dragon spines to lend it stability, a project his sons and their sons might work on, a fitting legacy for the promised longevity of Estolia. The mountain to the southwest was really two peaks, the shorter one nearest the valley. Hulking behind it was the larger mountain. A ridge ran down from one to the other, as if the bigger one was embracing the smaller, like a mother holding her child. Thrusting out of the top of the larger mountain was a buttress of stone, like a crown on the head of a king, giving it the illusion of much greater height. The shorter peak looked like it would be easy to climb, especially by a man on horseback. Perhaps he would set out a trail and bring his sons to the top, so they could look out over all the land whose prosperity would someday be their responsibility. Chapter 16. Within the Mountain.
I was once asked what our greatest treasure was. Was it the crown the king wore, or the antiques that furnished the palace? Were some treasures secreted within the temple, or hidden in the palace that were of greater value? I know that the question came from a place of curiosity, not avarice, and I could answer it in only one way. The greatest treasure within Estolia is priceless. There is no individual or nation upon this globe that could purchase it. No famine or need great enough to make us willing to part with it. I could see that my companion would not be satisfied with just that, so I clarified. Our greatest, most valuable treasure is the promise of Zaccarias to Deity. It secures for us longevity and prosperity, and above all other things, it grants us marital relationships greater and more profound than anywhere else in the world.
Beauregard Excalibur Zaccarian, Capitulo 85.
I feel the pull of Deity.
Sebastian finally spoke into the long stretch of silence that settled between the three men after their arrival.
It is clear to me that we must concentrate our attention on the smaller mountain to the southwest.
Zaccarias and Key both reined their horses in the direction Sebastian indicated. They travelled into the valley, heading between the two mountains. Zaccarias felt the presence of Deity in the form of a deep and abiding warmth. He was grateful she did not expect them to make their way in this world without guidance.
I knew it,
Sebastian exclaimed.
See, a cave!
He urged his horse forward at a faster clip, and the others followed him towards the dark opening at the base of the mountain. They reined to a halt at the entrance to the cave, just within the shadow of the mountain.
We should make our camp here, and once we have done so and made a fire, we will bring torches with us and explore the cave.
Sebastian's expression was full of boyish enthusiasm. Key gently touched both Zaccarias' and Sebastian's arms, and when he had their attention, he indicated his disagreement. Key was probably the most eloquent man Zaccarias knew, especially considering he was incapable of speech. Sebastian looked from Key to Zaccarias and said, "If Key thinks we should wait until morning to investigate, then we will wait." That night, the three men lay on their bedrolls, staring at the brilliant star-spattered sky. Zaccarias remembered his last night with his family in northern Anoxes before he joined the Ankhamun. His older brother, Phineas, had said to him, "I know you will be successful in your quest." They were standing next to the remains of his farewell bonfire. Zaccarias felt a great fondness for his brother, but he had to leave in order to make his fortune, since he would not inherit it. "Do you think we will meet again?" he asked his brother. Phineas looked up at the sky. Zaccarias followed his example, and the two brothers watched a shooting star. Only after the image faded from their night vision did Phineas answer, "No, Zac, we won't meet again. Mother and father know you will find your own future, your own path. I am certain we will meet in the life after this life. We will speak with each other about our adventures. Will you promise to seek me out?" Zaccarias hugged his brother, thumping him on the back, conveying the depth of his love. When he pulled away, he vowed, "There is no barrier in the life after this life which will stand between the two of us. I will seek you out, and we will share our adventures with one another." As Zaccarias' thoughts returned to the present, he saw another streaking light across the sky, and felt as if deity was confirming his promise to his brother. He would be able to meet him in the life after this life. Torizon was the word they used here in Estolia, and he would have the grandest adventures to share. As he drifted to sleep, he smiled at the thought of that future reunion. The next morning, the three men approached the symmetrical entrance. They climbed up a short slope of debris and stood in front of the cave. The entrance was wide and welcoming. Once inside, they paused. The cave was large and spacious, and it split in three directions. Directly ahead of them there was a small, roughly rectangular opening, while there were larger caves to right and left.
"I feel like we should explore this one,"
Sebastian said, gesturing to the aperture ahead of them. When neither of the other two men objected, they moved towards it. Once they entered, they stopped and looked around in awe. It was as if an enormous bubble of air was captured inside the mountain while it was formed, creating a perfectly egg-shaped chamber. The sides of the chamber sloped up gently in all directions. The ceiling wasn't visible to them by the light of their torches. The most remarkable feature of the entire cave was a single gigantic stalagmite rising from the ground on the far side of the chamber, and not quite meeting a matching stalactite dropping down towards it. As they approached the rock formation, Sebastian said,
"I believe this room could be adapted for religious ceremonies."
Zaccarias paused and closed his eyes, trying to feel with his heart and self what Sebastian was suggesting. He imagined rich-looking tiles, crisp lines, and an ambiance filled with the presence of deity. When he opened his eyes, he felt the shiver of celestial forces touching their mortal lives. Key led the way around the rock formation to an opening on the far wall. Once they stepped through, they could see the glint of light ahead of them. The three men moved towards the light and saw there was another entrance into the cave. They could see a little burbling brook and a nearly vertical wall of rock beyond it. The stone rose to impossible heights only a dozen feet on the other side of the brook.
"This is between the small forward peak and the larger peak towards the back."
Zaccarias paused and closed his eyes to breathe in the fragrance of the blossoms on a couple of mayberry trees on either side of the small brook. He turned back to his friends.
"I can imagine a place here where a newly attached couple might go to be alone, secluded, away from the never-ending requirements of real life, so they might spend a week with each other to solidify the most critical connection they will ever make, two souls merging to become one."
They turned their back on the sunlight shining down into the garden crevice and saw there were two caves branching off to right and left. They took the passageway to the right, moving deeper and deeper into the cave complex. Key began to lead the way, his motions sure and steady, until they were in a narrow passageway about as wide as a man was tall. At times they seemed to be climbing, as if they were approaching the very heart of the larger mountain.
It appears to be a labyrinth from this point onward,
Zaccarias said. He worried they would become lost if they traveled much further.
We should return to the horses,
Sebastian suggested. Key reluctantly agreed and led them back the way they came. He looked back several times, though there was nothing to see in the darkness. Chapter 17. Temple.
In my time as keeper of the soul of Estolia, I came to feel a great kinship with Key. One could look back on the historical accounts of the founders and say that, unlike succeeding generations, the role of the keeper of the soul of Estolia was held in part by three remarkable individuals: Key, Sebastian, and Zaccarias. My brother, on the other hand, always admired the stoicism of Sebastian, and was determined to name the heir to the throne after him.
Xavier Archimedes Zaccarian, Capitulo 86. By the time they left the cave, Zaccarias was feeling a strong sense of deity. He turned to Sebastian and asked, "What is your impression?"
This cave complex will become a great temple,
Sebastian retorted without pausing to think about it.
I am certain of it.
Zaccarias gestured across the valley. "And that mountain?"
The palace will go there. There the future king of Estolia will live, rule, and reign. Here will be the seat of power of the religion.
It felt as if Sebastian's proclamation about the cave complex behind them was stated with the overtones of the voice of deity. Zaccarias had no doubts left. This cave complex was critical to the religious future of his nation.
Will we relocate?
Key answered him, in his typical silent method. He touched both men, and it was clear what their future held. Sebastian translated,
Key states that it will be difficult to relocate while your wives have children still to bear. Within 5 years, there will be enough Estolians to create 2 settlements. There will be many years, many generations of hard toil before these mountains have realized the promise so potently within them.
All 3 men were solemn and pensive during the journey back to Promisa, each thinking their own thoughts about the visions that were theirs in that holy valley between 2 incredible mountains. When they moved to the valley, Key and Mari chose to live within the Temple Mountain. The small group who relocated discovered that the spacious plateau halfway up the northwestern peak was perfect in many ways. It had only one pathway up to it, which was easy to fence off, and there were multiple entrances leading into a cave complex. They settled easily within them, building smaller structures at the entrance to each cave home. Young Zaccarian and Amador were Zaccarias' true delight, along with their 3 sisters, Miriam, Talitha, and Sapphira. Zaccarian declared when they arrived in the valley that the entire region was to be named Amador after his brother. Amador, for his part, challenged his brother after that declaration.
And what will we call the 2 mountains?
Zaccarian said simply, "They shall be named after mother and father." Amador got that look that Zaccarias felt was indicative of a connection to deity his oldest son did not possess. His second son turned to look at the mountain with the temple.
That is Mount Estoliana, and like a mother holds her child, the larger is embracing the smaller.
His eyes met his father's, and he turned to look at the less impressive mountain and said,
"And that is Mount Zaccarias." "This then," piped up Miriam, their oldest sister, "must be the Zaccarian Plateau."
She was indicating the place where they established their home. Estoliana looked down at her daughter with a pleased smile.
Will we name anything after you, Talitha, or Saphira? Perhaps the next 3 settlements will be named after us,
Miriam said. She was, Zaccarias thought, her mother in miniature. Zaccarian was the one to respond to his sister. It makes perfect sense to name places after the 3 of you. Later that night, Estoliana sang one of the songs that was translated from its original verses in Anoxian to Estolian. When Saphira fell asleep, Estoliana gracefully got to her feet and joined Zaccarias, seated at a low table. She took the mayberry blossom tea he proffered her, and then sighed in contentment as she sipped the fragrant brew.
It is incredible,
she said to him quietly.
To think how far we have come in so short a time. How could I have known, on the day I climbed aboard the Ankhamun, that I would know such joy?
He looked at her beautiful face in the firelight, studying each feature briefly before responding, I thank deity every single day for pushing you to stow away on the Ankhamun. I would die without you now. I do not think I would have ever lived if I never met and rescued you. You are my everything. The Promise of Zaccarias was written by Sashina Kurfman and read by Ken Moss. Music was by Kevin MacLeod, Shady Dave, and Sora Music. Sound effects were by Free Sound. The Tales of Estolia audiobooks are produced by Maverick Productions.